welcome to episode 2 of Lost to the Nails. I used to say on my old show, as always, but this is the second time doing it. So I'm Brian. I'm joined by Eric.
Hi, everybody.
And we decided to bring in podcasting royalty. 9 pounds of podcasting swinging meat, the myth, the legend. We have Carl from the Independent Characters here.
Yeah, I mean, if it can be said I'm from that anymore, it doesn't. Well, it does. I mean, it's still a domain name, and sure. Hey, thanks for having me on, man. For your
Well, you know, I feel like I should, because I feel like I really fucked up on the last show for 6.5 years and never having you on the show. I was like, no, there's going to be the topic where it's going to make sense.
I think I was on once.
Were you?
I think. Yeah, I had to. No, you were on my show a couple of times.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, and I was not. I was rude. I didn't return the favor.
Oh, I think I was at least once, Brian.
Okay.
I think I was at least one time.
We'll say it was once, but
sure.
So here today,
you've now been on a full 50% of Lost to the Nails episodes.
This is true.
Yeah, this effectively makes me a cast member.
Yeah,
I've been there for half the episodes.
That's right. So today, Eric, what's our topic today?
So our topic today is 3D printing, and we're going to talk about sort of how that works, its impact on the hobby, and if you're interested in getting started, how to do that.
Thought you'd start off with a light topic, no controversy.
Yeah, you know, get out there early. We covered COVID. Now we're going to talk about 3D printing.
We'll probably talk about COVID before we go into 3D printing. So just to sprinkle a little extra dose of that. So this isn't a show where we're going to be doing a lot of news stuff, but I did want to mention the Kill Team stuff just went on pre-order this weekend. The reboot is really... There's some stuff, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, the weird, like, circles and shapes things. I don't think it's as bad as the Shadespire or Warhammer Underworlds, you know, where it's like, what do I need to hit? Hammers? No, wait, am I axes or spatulas? I don't know what it is. You know, it isn't. I don't think it's quite as convoluted, but it's a very well put together game.
Yeah.
Carl, you were probably sent a set, correct? Or
yeah.
Okay.
I have a copy.
Yeah, Eric, is this something that's showing up on your radar?
And I'd forgotten I had ordered one from Sky as well. So
sweet.
And I felt bad like backing out of the purchase, so I just purchased it. And so now I have 2 sets of this thing, and I'm like, I might give one away as a prize or something to my Discord members.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
You know, because I pass it on. Right? Yeah, I have a set. I think it looks great. I did say before the show, I still don't understand the circle triangle. Like,
yeah.
And Eric, I think you're maybe right for localization purposes, but when I look at it, I'm like, every time I have to look at this, I'm doing the math in my head, and it's algebra, and I'm like, okay, so 3 times x equals 6. Okay, cool. So a circle is 2. You know, but at its core, like, it looks fun. It looks super fun. I've not had a chance to play it. I read the Goonhammer stuff on it. I think they did an awesome overview of all of it. So super excited. I know they've been playing a bunch. So, you know, I've always enjoyed Kill Team, and I think it gives an opportunity now, especially to start up, you know, multiple kill teams if I want. It's so easy to do. And, does my old Kill Team work? No, of course not. You know, there's no Terminators right now, but come on, they're going to expand this.
Sure.
They're going to expand it. You know, who cares?
Sure. Eric, is it something that showed up on your radar as far as picking it up, or?
So my local group hasn't talked about it very much. I'm sort of been dragging my feet to see if it gets picked up or not. Because I've been doing enough crusading to get people to play games that don't get played in my area with AT-18 and Aeronautica that I don't feel like adding a third to that list.
Gotta burn that bridge down.
Yeah, gotta burn that bridge down. But I do admit, yesterday I was on Sky's store with some stuff in my shopping cart. Because
Eric,
like I can tell myself that great lie of Kill Team, which is, it's just a Kill Team.
Eric, so you haven't bought the box set?
I haven't bought the box set.
I'm gonna have Sky send you mine instead.
All right, thank you, Carl.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. I think it would be a lot of fun when we see each other. We'll play some Kill Team.
There you go.
Hey, Eric.
Reach out to Sky right now.
Hey, Eric, when the next box game comes out, we're gonna have Carl on. And he's going to send that one to me.
Just invite Carl every time there's a box game.
Hey, he can be my gaming sugar daddy. It's fine. So, so I got to say, they put out the thing where they showed like the roadmap, right? They were showing like codexes that are coming up, but then they also showed for Kill Team this idea that I think is really cool where, okay, this is our set. We're going to have, you know, Krieg versus Orc Commandos, whatever the deal is. And this is going to be our box set. This is the Warzone we're going to do for 3 months. And then we're going to do another one. So weirdly enough, when the box set came out, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to get the basic rules because I don't need... I love terrain. I would love, but I don't need to make an entire orc table because that's what that would lead to. And I was like, let's just, I'll just order all the stuff. But then I also said, I'm not going to have time in the next 3 months to play anything, to play any of those. Like I'm doing
starting.
I'm starting work. And also I'm starting a 40K, crusade campaign. And I'm like, look, that's going to be all of my time. And I'm trying to, you know, when we get into a little COVID update here, I'm trying to limit my exposure and contacts or, tighten the gaming circle up a lot. And it's like, I'm not really going to have time, but now I don't have to feel like I'm missing out because if they're coming out with another Warzone in 3 months, they might come out with something that is, you know, spiky Marines, you know, chaos or some pointy eared, you know, Eldari variety thing. And if that happens, I'll just pick up that set, you know, because then I'll be jazzed and jacked for it. I mean, in the meantime, I think I'm going to pick up the compendium just to, I mean, you can look at the Goonhammer articles and figure out what the basic composition is. But, you know, I might say, you know what, I want to paint a fill in the blank kill team. You know, I bought that Catachan Sergeant, the one with the bolter. And I'm like, you know, maybe I'll do a Catachan one, you know, because you get a command box and that kind of a thing. It could be kind of fun, you know, But for me, them spelling out the roadmap was what really made me look at it and say, well, wait a minute, there could be another set that I'm actually into, you know, versus, you know, you're looking at, well, wait a minute, I get the rule book, I get the weird circle, triangle, square, whatever. That's a big Aikido thing.
I'll get used to it. It's
triangle, circle, square.
You know?
But yeah, it's weird, but, you know, everybody will adjust to it. But I was like, you know what? It actually gave me permission. Well, not permission. I'm a grown man. I can do whatever the hell I want, but I looked at it and I'm like, oh no, I wasn't planning on playing Kill Team in the next few months. And this gives me an opportunity to go, well, let's see what's in the next one, you know, and maybe that's the one that I do. And if I have to wait, you know, 2 or 3 to get into it, that's fine. You know, trust me, I have a backlog of things that I can do in the meantime. So
you do not have to keep up with everything Games Workshop puts out.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And I think
feel like
that's a fallacy that people fall into. And they're like, I have to buy this now, you know.
Yeah, FOMO is a hell of a drug.
Yeah, people talk about FOMO for Games Workshop a lot, and I think it's actually a really big deal for them to be like, it'll be here for a year.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay.
Yeah.
And just the fact that they've done that, like, that graphic suggests Kill Team is going to be actively supported for at least a year with, you know, releases on a fairly regular basis. Yeah. And as anyone who has ever played a game that rhymes with Horus Heresy will tell you, having that communicated to you is a big deal.
Yeah.
Heresy. Yeah. Unfortunately, Horus Heresy, you can't flip the letters. It does the same thing. But, you know, it's, you know, because we've looked at box sets. So, like, what was it? Apocalypse. Like, Apocalypse was a great release that was one and done.
Oh, my God.
And so if you missed I missed the enthusiasm for everyone wanting to play Apocalypse because something was going on in my life for a month. And I still haven't opened that box.
I got to tell you, I don't know. I mean, I don't have any internal information about it, but I don't think it hit as hard as they had hoped. And they kind of they took their foot off the pedal on it, you know, because I think there was like their intention. There was like kind of like 3 ways that you played 40K, right? Kill Team, 40K, Apocalypse. And I think Apocalypse, like if you think about it, it really only appeals to people with really large collections.
Yeah.
And so it's probably a smaller audience of people.
It's a smaller audience, but I was shocked at how quickly it dropped out. Because I mean, when it wasn't like we're going to give it, you know, 8 months to a year to see if it catches on. I mean, it was like there were no follow-up releases for it.
No,
whatsoever. And like from the rules writing team, like if you look at units that have changed or units that have been added, none of that stuff's been done. You know, so and it wasn't even like, oh, we'll just do a little, you know, a PDF or a White Dwarf article or something. It was just, okay, it's like the It's like the two Primarks that we just don't talk about anymore. You know, they're just, I know there's numbers, but just don't worry about that. So, and it's too bad because it's a fantastic game. So
it was fun.
But, well, I hate to go Debbie Downer from that because that was kind of a fun, I like talking about Apocalypse and games like that. But last time we talked about COVID and like opening up your group and, you know, getting people back to playing, but also safety precautions. We had my friend John, who's an ICU nurse, and obviously Eric, who's an epidemiologist. I thought when we were recording it, I was like, wow, I kind of feel like we're doom and glooming it a little bit here. Eric, I think I was being a bit optimistic, wasn't I?
Yeah, I think John and I both afterwards said, yeah, we thought we were soft pedaling it a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Lost to the Nails COVID-19 corner. We've got since we recorded that. So when we recorded that, the U.S. vaccination campaign was still going pretty well. We were actually sort of, as I put it, we blew our largest economy in the world cool down, and things were going okay because we were doing that. Since then, the vaccine uptake rates, if you look at sort of the cumulative doses over time, has well and truly stalled out, well below where it needs to be. And importantly, in between that episode and this one, the Delta variant of COVID-19 went from this is something people in the U.S. are sort of concerned about on a sort of professional epidemiology level to this is definitely the dominant form of COVID spreading in the United States. The Delta variant spreads better. It spreads better amongst vaccinated folks. And generally speaking, it's sort of gone hog wild and is running through, especially unvaccinated populations. Folks are just getting hit really hard. So I'm sort of back in a place where, especially with kids going back to school, colleges reopening, there wasn't really any mechanism for what if we do remote for another year. I think everybody essentially said we can't. And I think that's hit especially younger populations really hard. We're seeing a huge increase in cases in kids and young adults. And I've sort of gone back to not quite being as cautious as I was in, like, say, December and January of last year. But I'm definitely at, like, our local gaming group has gone back to masks are mandatory if you're in the clubhouse. And I've started to rethink things like, do I want to go to this particular event or not? Speaking of which, if you are going to the New Orleans GT that Games Workshop is putting on, you still have time to get both doses of your vaccine. Please do it. So yeah, that's where we are, is I think a much more pessimistic place than episode 1.
Yeah. So I went back and looked at, you know, about the time when we recorded and looked what the numbers were. Like Santa Cruz County, where I live, was absolutely crushing it at that point. I mean, like our 7-day case average was like 2 per day. Now we're at 68. We went from 2 to 68 as of August 14th. Santa Clara County, which is next to us, which is where San Jose is, you know, it's a much larger area. They went from 34 cases a day to 353 cases a day. And last night, I started up this summer playing hockey again, you know, and I'm not playing goaltender, so I'm playing as a defenseman, so I'm in contact with more people versus being in, you know, my little area. Sharks Ice put out a memo a couple of weeks ago saying, look, you know, per the county rules, you're going to have to wear a mask, not just when you're inside the facility. Before, if you were, it was an honor system thing. If you were vaccinated, you could skate on the ice maskless. 2 weeks ago, they said, no, everybody needs to wear one. And I missed the first game back from that. And when I went to this one, you know, I'm standing outside with the players from both teams, you know, and everybody's masked up doing their thing. One ref walks up with the chin diaper, you know, which is, you know, the mask down under the chin. And then the other ref, who I know, this is one of the guys who taught me to play hockey 15 years ago, walks up and he has, you know, the half-ass neck gaiter thing down around his neck. No attempt to pull it on at all. And I'm like, oh, so this is what the fuck we're doing. Okay. And the thing was, as soon as the players saw the refs not wearing anything,
they didn't wear them.
You saw during the warm-ups, you saw 3 guys on my team take them off, 5. And at the end of the game, I think my defensive partner also has a young unvaccinated kid, and we're both in the same boat of, I don't care if I'm sucking fire out there and can't breathe. Like playing hockey with a mask on is fucking miserable. Yeah, but you know what? What are we doing here? And by the end of the game, there were maybe 5 between the 2 teams that were on. And my defensive partner and I were 2 of them. And on the way home, I was driving, and during the game, I was giving the ref shit that I knew. I was like, hey man, how's the future look when there's no pandemic? Like, what are we doing here? And he just kind of laughed, and I'm like, this isn't funny, and on the way home, it's a good 40-minute drive for me going back to Santa Cruz. I mean, I just started grinding the hate wheel in my head, and I was like, maybe I'm just pissed off because we got absolutely smoked by a team that should be 2 divisions up from where we're playing. But then the next morning, this morning I woke up and I was like, Eric, you were talking about, it was the risk budget, correct?
Yeah.
My risk budget is, I have a 6-year-old who missed out on kindergarten, who's going to be going to 1st grade Tuesday. I can't jeopardize or fuck that up for her because she had a really rough year not going to school. There were things where she fell behind. I worked with her this summer. I work at a very small school where there's only 150 students. There's, 12, 15 faculty, and I'm in contact with pretty much everybody. And I can't, my budget is filled, so I texted my wife this morning and I was like, I'm done. I can't play the rest of this league. I'm not going to sign up for the fall league either because it's just not there, and it's like, it is what it is. Am I going to try to fight every single person on the rink there and, that kind of a thing? I can send a sternly worded, Karen-esque email, but that's about the end of it. I'm just not going to put the effort into doing that. I just have bigger fish to fry, so from a gaming standpoint, I'm like, look, keep it small and take some pretty basic precautions and, do my job and take the basic precautions there and, live your life. But I just can't, for a thrill of, getting to run around and chase a puck in a beer league game. I'm not going to jeopardize everything else that I'm doing and what my kids are doing for that.
Yeah.
So
I think that's smart.
Yeah. Well, hey, let's go from that incredibly depressing note.
It just sucks.
Yeah.
Like we were doing so good. And
yeah.
People are, and I get that people are tired and exhausted and want to just do this, but it's a case of a few screwing it up for everybody. So
yeah.
We can do.
Yeah. I did the math a couple days ago. It's been 573 days since I sent a graduate student of mine an email asking if she wanted to work on an emerging coronavirus in China.
Wow.
I'm tired too, y'all.
Yeah,
wear your damn mask.
Right.
And like I told you on Loopy's show, right?
Yeah.
When it first came out, I was like, it's the bird flu. It's this. It's always, and it never seems to. And I owed Eric an apology. Yeah. Because Eric was like, well, we're looking at this pretty seriously. And I'm like, okay, well, let's take a look. And next thing I'm like, okay, Eric's right.
I would really like to be wrong.
I wish you were, man.
Yeah.
I would really, really like
I'd like to be going, told you.
Right. Yeah, Eric, stop being right. Stop being right. So
that's fortunate. Anyway.
Well, so I was trying to figure out a transition here because I'm like, we are going to get the negative part of 3D printing out of the way. We want to get all the hate out of the way early so we can go in and have some fun discussing this.
Speaking of, this is how you transition.
Oh, there you go.
Speaking of how upset people are about coronavirus, let's talk about 3D printing.
Speaking of a few fucking it up for everybody else, 3D printing. So before we go into this topic, I mean, there is, Eric put in our notes, the IP elephant in the room. Eric, what do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is the 3D printing community has sort of, and this is true for, we've seen this with some other stuff. Games Workshop has a very distinct IP. And yes, that IP is a melange of other themes and tropes and visual stuff that has occurred before them. But at this point, Games Workshop has a very visual style. And there is some 3D printing stuff that sort of emulates that style. And you get the, grimdark or gothic or whatever the vibe you want to call it is. And there's some things where you're like, oh, yeah, I saw that model on the new releases page for Games Workshop 2 days ago. and here it is on the internet, free for download. And so there is definitely there's an aspect of the 3D printing hobby that is at best skirting the line on, is this sort of IP theft, and at worst is just genuine, this is just digital recasting.
Right. Eric, you and I were hanging out with Colin the other night, doing some hobbying about a week ago. And he mentioned, because I remember seeing this, so like you do have that where whenever the newest thing, the newest codex, the newest outrage for like a minute before the next codex comes out, and people get triggered by something else because the internet. Before the Boise GT was the AdMech codex. And I remember seeing when I looked at the results, because I wanted to see how Colin and Mark were doing up there. And I remember looking at the top 10 and I'm like, that's an awful lot of AdMech. And I know there are AdMech players, but wow, you'd have to really put something together pretty quickly. And then he mentioned, he was like, yeah, 4 of the top 10 armies were like 3D printed. And that's a very different thing. Like Eric, you printed like closed canopies for the what's the new Primaris speeder? The Storm Speeder Storm.
It doesn't start with an I, so I don't remember it.
Okay. The Interspeeder.
But yeah, I printed some of those for Colin. There's a closed cockpit version that makes it look different.
Yeah.
I printed some stuff like that. I've printed like alternate armor plates for Titanicus Titans that have, specific Legio logos on them and stuff like that. But there is a thing, and I think it's been exacerbated both by sort of the competitive community doing a little bit of meta chasing,
sure,
and how that intersects with Games Workshop's supply issues. So that like the things that are hot on the tournament scene right now are not necessarily in stock on the website.
Right.
And an easy solution to that is, okay, I'm just going to print 3 of them.
Yeah.
And
like Storm Speeders.
Like Storm Speeders, or, I think it was like Skitarii Rangers. You just find find a file, print, 20 of your guys that do mortal wounds on a 4 to hit or whatever it was, and, go from there. And I think that's a thing that definitely happens. Where that becomes, I think, a bigger problem is when that's also the sum total of the effort you put in. I don't think anyone... I've likened this to buying an Imperial Guard army from something like Victoria Miniatures. Yeah, like, it's her own style, and she's done her own work. It's honestly on a slightly different scale, but it's definitely echoing stuff that exists in the 40K universe.
Right.
But if you bought those and built them and assembled them and painted them well, no one's going to say a thing at your local event. If you have a 3D printed army and you put the effort into, making sure there's variety in those units, painting them up well, otherwise being a pleasant opponent, I don't think anyone's going to be mad about that. The problem, I think, really comes when you print the same pose for 27 guys in your army.
Ugh. And
you go, well, primer gray is a color, so that's color number 1. And I'm going to stick them on some black bases and maybe smear some texture paint on that. That you get that, like, why are we here? Why are we not just using tokens? And I think that's the thing, is whenever you trigger that feeling in your opponent, especially if you're someone who has come with a fully painted army that you put work into, you don't have to be Colin Ward, but, if you've got a fully painted army that you've thought about and based and stuff like that, and the guy across from you might as well be using little plastic circles with, tank written on the base. Why? And I think that's where it gets really frustrating for folks.
We're talking about sort of crossing a line, right? So at that point, it's like you're creating an experience for other people that isn't good. It's basically the equivalent, like you said, it's digital recasting is more or less what it is. Even though, I mean, if you look at painted stuff at tournaments, there's a lot of Forgery World at tournaments. It's too readily available. But the IP line thing is very interesting because there are things, I bought a lot of stuff from, I'm going to use Pop Goes the Monkey as an example. I mean, they have a ton of bits on their site. It is very clearly, there was a thing where the owner of it was, I remember seeing a thing on his Facebook page where he did some sort of a logo that was like clearly a 1,000 Sun thing or something. And he was like, Games Workshop says that Games Workshop claims they own the sun or something like that. And I'm like, no, that's clearly a Warhounds. I can see the Legion that it is. And I bought at the time because when the Primaris stuff came out, they didn't have any Imperial Fists, Crimson Fists logos.
But when you slap a sun on a Space Marine shoulder pad, now you're combining two things that actually are protected.
Yeah.
It's not just that logo, it's also the context in which that logo is used.
Yeah.
That generates the conflict.
Right.
Yeah.
But listen.
Yeah.
let me just throw in my 2 cents here, because I am I get it. Like, I have a 3D printer. I print tons of terrain on my 3D printer. I do not have a resin printer yet. And the only reason I don't was because I didn't hit submit on the form, because I looked around at all the models I had and I was like, what am I
to what end, sir?
Why do I really need to make more models? I'm not playing D in person. I don't, but I can see in the future getting one for various reasons. Here's the thing. If people have justified to themselves that this is okay to do, we're never going to argue them out of that position. No. When I used to work, I worked like loss prevention for a retail company, and we went to training on how do you interview an employee who has stolen stuff, and like, how do you get them to admit that here's how much they've stolen and whatever.
Yeah.
You literally go through this phase of that discussion called the justification phase, where you're like, look, you work a lot of hours. This company doesn't pay a lot. Of course you're going to, why wouldn't you're practically owed that shirt that you stuck in your bag.
You're your own equalizer, right?
And I see in these IP discussions, I'll just go to ChinaCast and or Forge World or whatever. I see those exact same arguments. Well, Games Workshop's quality isn't there.
Right.
They charge too much. And maybe this isn't the hobby for you. I would like a newer Porsche. I do not go take one because
Porsche charges too much.
Because Porsche charges too much. Yes. Yeah. If I want that car, this is what I'm going to have to pay. I can look around for deals.
Right.
But ultimately, can I go 3D print a Porsche? No, I can't. But if that technology existed, would I? I don't know. Maybe. So, I mean, everybody has their limit and their breaking point.
Sure.
But this all boils down to fundamentally people saying, this hobby, I don't want to spend the money on it, but I want to get the enjoyment out of it.
Yeah.
Boom. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
I don't want to spend the money, but I want to play it. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of things in life I want to do, but I have to decide where I spend my money.
Right.
And so what they do is that this particular hobby just has a way in which you can get around that to a degree.
Yeah.
And so people will do that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was thinking about that with the stuff that I'd bought. Like I was mentioning, before they made any sort of a Primaris, fist logo for Crimson Fists or Imperial Fists, I was like, okay, well, they aren't making the product. They make the little round insert things that you can just put on, and I'm like, it does a thing like the old, because back in the day with my 3rd, 4th, 5th edition Crimson Fist, I bought the old metal pads, and you had to Dremel them out because they didn't fit the shoulder socket of the normal arm or anything. But I was like, and I want my stuff to look uniform, and I hate doing a round field on a curved pad. I don't care how much microset you use. It's a pain in the ass, and I do a lot of painting, and it ain't worth my time. And then, of course, they came out with a plastic set, and I'm like, all right. So those are the ones that I've been using since then. So it is a thing where, I mean, they put out their statement as far as what they just sort of reiterated what was already there as far as their policy of what you can use at Warhammer World and that kind of a thing. And a lot of people were getting upset about it. There was nothing new in there. It was
Most people said about that, by the way, do not play at Warhammer World or Warhammer stores.
Which is exactly my point. that is going to affect me exactly 0 times.
I'm
not going to make it there.
Stores. I will go play at Warhammer World on occasion.
Right.
Okay, I brought my stuff, you know.
Yeah.
But I sat there when the Warlord Titan had come out with members of the staff who had built and painted it and were showing it to me, and they were so excited to show it and how it looked and cool. And these guys came over and were looking at it, and one of them had the balls to say, "Oh, I'll just get it when it comes out through a Chinese website." And he didn't realize who he was freaking talking in front of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
You're talking to people who actually put,
those guys are
hours and potentially years of their lives into sculpting that.
And I'm like, if it's okay to do, if that's an okay thing to do, then have the balls to tell the people who made it, right?
Yeah.
And if you can't, like, if you think like that is, oh, well, that's an awkward situation. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is, because you're wrong.
And that might tell you something.
And of course, on the internet, people be like, "Oh, I'd tell them to their face." Sure.
Yeah.
You're a
Yeah.
tough guy.
Yeah. I'd also knock out Conor McGregor with one punch.
But then
too,
you'd
right?
also be an asshole.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or you're an asshole in real life, which is
cool.
always a possibility. And Brian, kind of to what you were talking about, I think for me, the things I sort of think about is there a GW version of this?
Mm-hmm.
Can I just buy this from GW? I'm going to buy it from GW. So like
I may look around for a deal.
Yeah, I may look around for a deal. I may ask somebody at the club, like, "Hey, does anyone have an extra sprue of this they're not using?" But like when it comes down to it, if the answer to that is no, I will go to Herrick or the GW site and order it. It tends to be because Carl, you made the right choices. I'm currently surrounded by pieces of resin that I need to now paint to not buy Resin Printer. But when I print something, is there a kind of terrain that they don't sell for Adeptus Titanicus? Is there a bit that they don't sell? So like, again, for Colin, I printed this a set for Colin and a set for me for the Ordo Sinister Warlord.
Nice.
There's a tilting shield and a shoulder plate with the lion head logo on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I printed those. GW doesn't make those.
Yeah.
That's another resin piece to go on their already resin kit.
Yeah.
If they made them.
If they made them, I buy them from GW.
Right.
The stuff where so Soulforge Studios makes a really good line of what is definitely Battlefleet Gothic.
God.
It is visually the Battlefleet Gothic ships. They're amazing. I will give those guys credit for putting a lot of effort and work into doing something that's actually more detailed and sort of
absolutely
what I feel like the modern GW sculptors would do with their stuff. I mean, they're doing like a line of Gloriana class battleships.
Oh yeah.
Where they're like going through and they're like, what would a Dark Angels battleship look like as compared to an Iron Warriors one? And like, well, they're currently working on the one for the Space Wolves, and they've got a bunch of reference images of longboats and stuff like that on there. But it's still very clearly Battlefleet Gothic. If Games Workshop comes out with Battlefleet Gothic, I'm going to buy Battlefleet Gothic ships.
Right.
But in the meantime, I literally can't buy
You have no other options.
I have no other option, and it doesn't exist. And I think the real thing for me is if creative effort went into the person creating the 3D parts, or if all that effort was, how do I exactly duplicate something GW already makes?
And I want to point out, Eric, that both you and I'm on that boat with you. GW doesn't make it, blah, blah, blah. But even that is part of our justification phase.
Oh, yeah,
right.
That's absolutely
but
my
that's
justification.
the level that I'm comfortable with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? I don't feel like I'm stealing from the people who produce the hobby I love because they don't make this thing. I would love for them to make it.
Yeah.
Please do so. When you do, I'm in. You know.
So
but that is how far I sink in my justification.
But I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm right there.
I can't give you my money. So
Yeah.
I'm going to give someone else my money. And the thing that I think is really, really sad that I'm going to put in here before I
Stop trying
interrupting Brian again is
I keep holding up two fingers. I'm like,
the small creators who do put a lot of energy into stuff, their stuff also immediately shows up on sites for free, and you see that, and it's like, then none of those justifications come in.
Right.
No, they're not the big faceless publicly traded company that's been, abusing their poor fan base for decades. Right. This is just some guy who made a super cool looking thing.
Right.
And had the audacity to ask for $4 for it.
Oh God.
Yeah. And that's the one where I get actually like angry.
Right.
Because the whole argument breaks down at that point.
Yeah, because the whole argument breaks down, and then it's just like, okay, you just didn't want to pay for stuff.
There you go.
So 2 things.
Hold on a second, Brian. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was like, I was kind of hoping somebody would interrupt me again, because I'm like, this is a good running gag here for a second. 2 things. The Soulforge Space Wolves Gloriana ship is actually called, it has the word Paw Patrol in the title.
Yeah, it's called the Paw Patroller,
which is fucking phenomenal. Like, I want it just so I can say I painted the Paw Patrol, even though I don't need a Space Wolves battle. Well, I don't need any more Battlefleet Gothic stuff. I said lying to myself, but
all their Gloriana names
so
are
much
great.
Battlefleet Gothic stuff.
I do love it. The second thing that I was going to say was, when we were talking about that thing where, so I bought 2 Primarks that are very clearly Primarks. I bought a definitely not Mortarion, but like regular 40k demon print sized. And I bought a definitely not Angron 30k Primark thing. When I look at those things, like, the IP has clearly been ripped off, especially the Angron one. Like, there is just no way to justify that one. I mean, the skull, everything, it's a better pose, I think, than the Forge World one. And of course, I did the mental gymnastics where I told myself, well, I own the Forge World one, and I'm not buying this in place of the other one, because I legitimately do. Like, if I'm going to go play in an event, I'm going to use my regular Forge World one, even though this one's going to be better painted. But I just wanted to paint it just to paint the thing. The other one that is definitely not Mortarion is, like a regular 40k demon print size. And I bought it because I wanted one on foot, which is the normal fine cast one. And I wanted one that is winged and flying around. And but it's so obviously Mortarion. It's not the same sculpt as the other one, but when you look at the design work that went into it, the assembly of this thing is so absolutely intricate to make sure that it's suspended by these little sensors that are hanging from chains, and the flowing robes and everything that incorporate into the base in a way that has made it a complete pain in the ass to convert this 40 mil thing and insert it into a 60 mil. But somebody put a ton of work in it. I bought it off of Etsy from a printer in Poland. The model showed up, and it is, I knew that resin printers were good. I mean, we'll get into this when we go into types. I knew resin printers were good. I had no idea they were this good. I mean, it is absolutely phenomenal quality. But I don't know who made that original file, because I can go on to Etsy and find other people that are printing it. You can get it at different scales. So there's one that's like made obviously to print it at a Mortarion, current 40k model size. The price on it is so ridiculous for printing it, but I'm sure there's a file out there for doing it and printing that. So I don't know if the person that designed it got money from this person. I don't know if they purchased a license in order to do it. I don't know. It's kind of a weird, black market-ish sort of thing. But, I did the mental gymnastics like you guys were talking about well, they don't make a winged demon prince, and I wanted to have one that looks a little bit different. Now, I'm not going to show up to Warhammer World and bust this thing out and go, yeah, you guys didn't design this, suck it. Like, that's clearly not the intention, but you do have to be aware sort of your mental gymnastics that you're doing to justify some of these things. Like, I think it is important to call yourself out a little bit on it. So with this thing, I mean, when we get into like the quality and stuff like that, we'll talk about these a little bit more. But Eric, why don't you take us into, now we can stop preaching about IP infringement or COVID or anything. Let's actually talk about types of 3D printing here. So Eric, what are the 2 main types that are out there right now?
Sure. So there's 2 main types of 3D printers. The first one is filament printers. FDM is the abbreviation. I can't remember what it stands for. But what it essentially is you've got a long cable. It's essentially plastic welding wire. And what you're doing is you're putting down continuous layers of melted plastic that then cools down, rehardens, and you've got plastic. This was what most people think of when you say 3D printer. It's the thing with the moving print head, the bed that moves. And the nice part about filament printers is this is where making models gets dirt cheap. Filament is just not very expensive for how much you can use. All of these models are essentially hollow, so that you're only really printing the outside and then just enough sort of support structure on the inside to keep it from collapsing in on itself. And what you do there is you're getting usually fairly fast, usually pretty straightforward prints that have very clear layer lines on them. Yeah. You can see each layer as you essentially set down that layer of plastic. You can see where that layer was set down and where the intersection of those layers are. So you get these sort of striations as you go up that, depending on how you fiddle with your printer, those can be bigger, they can be smaller, but they'll always be there.
Yeah.
And that's the first kind. The second kind of printer is a resin printer, which we've mentioned a couple times, which is essentially, if you think about it, it's essentially a LED light source that's UV sitting right on top of the screen from a cell phone. That what it does is it essentially lets UV light come through up. So don't stare at a resin 3D printer. And then sitting above that is literally a vat of resin. And it's just a vat of toxic goo that a metal plate comes down on. You get a very, very, very thin amount of space in between the metal plate and the bottom of the vat. You shine UV light on it for a bit. The resin that gets hit by that hardens. You lift up the plate to essentially rip it off a piece of plastic that's separating everything. And then you do it again. And you do that a couple thousand times. And what you get from that is much, much, much better detail. So it's the layer lines on resin pieces are still visible if you go looking for them, but it's much, much higher resolution. It's much better detail. They tend to be a bit pricier in terms of things. That's why if you're talking about, a Mortarian scale, Mortarian in resin printing, that's not cheap. That's not cheap if you're doing good resin. It's especially not cheap if you build in the fact that you'll sometimes screw this up and you'll have a part not work. And so what that is you get you get essentially very close to, people claim it's the same, but it's not. You get very close to sort of injection molded plastic quality if you go in on it. This works really well for small pieces. This is good for things like printing single figures, printing Adeptus Titanicus terrain, where you're going to want little light covers that look right at 8mm scale, which means they're basically a single pixel.
Right.
Stuff like that where you get much higher detail. They're complex in a different way. They've come to be about the same price, but the one big complaint about them is handling that stuff's a pain. Because what happens is it's in a vat of liquid resin that you definitely should not be touching without nitrile gloves. Nitrile, it will go through latex. Nitrile gloves, and then it comes out and it's still dripping in that stuff. You've got to wash it in isopropyl alcohol. Now you've got isopropyl alcohol with liquid resin in it. Then you've got to cure it under a UV light or the sun if you live someplace with lots of sun. And so it's just it's a bit more burdensome. I have a whole theory on the scale of difficulty for 3D printers. Because the filament printers, when they go wrong in really spectacular ways. They're also sort of a pain to deal with. But the sort of ambient pain in the ass of resin printers is significantly higher.
So let me jump in here real quick. I have a filament printer, not a resin printer, as Eric was just talking about. I have a Prusa Mark III filament printer, super easy to use. One of the things when I got into that hobby was I didn't want another hobby. I just wanted a tool that worked. The Prusa for me has been that tool. And actually it was Doug Johnson from Table War that kind of convinced me this is the one to get, because he was printing out terrain. He's like, dude, this thing's a workhorse. I don't have to do anything. the bed, like what do they call it? Like it stabilizes itself. Everything's automatic. Like you don't have to dial things in. And sure enough, like I printed probably thousands of dollars worth of terrain out of this thing right now. I'm printing like basically a D&D village right now out of all the, and I've bought the STLs from companies that sell them so that I can, STL being the file.
Yeah.
To make. And it's super easy, but I agree with Eric, especially on the striation lines. There's ways that they kind of hide them. It depends on the model you're printing. Like it may be hidden because the texture of the model itself is stonework on this thing. And so you don't really kind of notice it. It gets kind of hidden in there. And then, as I said, I think I paid maybe $1,200 all in for this printer, shipping and everything. The next one I'm looking at, just for comparison purposes, also by Cruz, although not actually originally built by them, but now they've taken it over, is their Prusa SL1S curing and printer and curing machine, right? They have like two separate machines you can buy to help with the UV light Eric was talking about. Combined, that's about $2,600. And so a significant amount. And to Eric's point, like with the extruder and everything for my PLA printer, the one I already own, is super easy to deal with. Like there's not any really hassle. Every now and then I wipe it down with some oil to make sure everything's running smooth. But I want to change to a new bundle of what do you call it, Eric?
Filament.
Filament. I extract it, I put it in, boom, I'm off. I'm printing again.
Yeah, you go down to the menu, you hit change filament, and away you go.
Takes out the old one, you put in the new one, boom, you're off and printing again. It prints overnight. I'm not even hearing it. It's just with the resin printer. One of the things holding me back from that is, okay, where am I going to put it? It's probably going to have a different smell. You have to cure it. You have to, as you mentioned, use special gloves because you don't want to touch this stuff. It's toxic. How do you dispose of that toxic stuff? There's like a bunch involved in it.
I have one of each. I love them both. They're both my precious children. Like Carl, I started with, I don't want this to be a second hobby. I just want this to facilitate my hobby. It escaped into the wild, and now it's a hobby, as hobbies do.
Yeah.
But there's definitely there's a lot more sort of footprint and apparatus to the resin one. So I have a resin printer, a carrying station. Carl, I might try to talk you out of the Prusa one, but like that setup is there.
Let's talk then, because I am.
And then I've got, like, right now, because how you dispose of resin impregnated isopropyl alcohol is either you take it to the dump and hand them a bucket of hazardous materials and say, deal with this, or you let it sit outside and evaporate, and then you
in the
sunlight. So I've also got like 3 plastic buckets of toxic isopropyl alcohol sitting on my driveway.
Yeah, it's a toxic dump. It is
like it's a thing. So moving on to that. The things you can print with these things are basically terrain and figures.
Yeah.
Sorry, Eric, I have to interrupt. Only because it won't make any sense later, and I want to explain why I've been giggling in the background. I feel like I'm in one of those workout videos, where like, Eric, you are the all-in, super jacked person who's doing the exercise. Carl, you're the person who's kind of doing the mid-range thing. And I'm the person who doesn't own any of this stuff and really listens to it and is horrified by the time commitment. I'm like the person in the workout video who's like barely lifting their foot right now.
Shuffling their feet back and forth.
I'm telling you, when I read, you did a Variance Hammer article that was talking about this and what is involved. And because you printed out some Battlefleet Gothic ships that are, the quality is phenomenal. Like I was showing people that know the game. This is my metal Retribution battleship. This is the resin printed Emperor class battleship. And the almost all of them just said, holy shit, when they saw the difference in the two. But when I read the steps involved, and talking about the toxic glue and there's UV light and you need to use these gloves and not these because it'll burn straight through. And then you need a spot and you need ventilation. And I was like, at every one of those steps, I was like, I'm out. I'm out.
That's the gating factor for me too, Brian.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, I could set it up in the garage. I have to make sure it's in an area where there's free of dust and
yeah.
Yeah, like we moved in, like, so I got my resin printer and started really using it when we moved into a new house that my home office setup has an extra bathroom with a large counter because it's supposed to be sort of a mother-in-law suite style thing. And so there was this big counter right by the window with a bathroom ventilation fan, and I was like, perfect.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're talking about. It is a lot of work. And yeah, I am now the person who's gone all in with the, custom weights and the sweatbands.
Doing CrossFit over there, Brian.
Doing CrossFit over there. That's the thing is airbrushes are passe now. Now it's 3D printer.
Now it's 3D printer.
Oh.
So the first real thing for miniatures wargamers that you can print, and I think this is where a lot of people start, and it's where if this is all you ever did, like your 3D printer has paid for itself, is printing terrain.
Terrain. Yep.
Terrain is lends itself really good to 3D printing for a couple reasons, and especially filament 3D printing. The first is, and Colin Ward and I have talked about this a lot, painting terrain is a very weird thing because you want it to look good, but not so good that it overshadows your figures.
Right.
3D printed stuff is great for that. Like if you paint it up, you can do some things like Carl said to disguise the layer lines. Like there's a one company I buy through that does a lot of things on rock faces, so you don't really notice because it's rock, things like that. You paint it up, it looks good. It doesn't look amazing, but terrain doesn't have to look amazing.
Right.
I looked at a lot of the sort of Zone Mortalis / Necromunda kits from Games Workshop, and looking at those, if you painted all the detail on each one of those bulkheads, you're talking about decades worth of work for that board.
Brian knows he painted my Forge World Zone.
Yeah, or a single unit of Brian Harvey, and so maybe you don't have to do that. And I think that's one of the places where filament printers do really well is you can print out a thing and you can have some sort of gun platform or a bunker or something that can be done in a day. And one of the nice parts about it is there's a lot of creators who are making things that are, again, 40K-ish, but are Eldar terrain or Necron terrain works really well for 3D printing because it's all just geometric shapes anyway.
Yep.
Tau terrain.
There's Kickstarter after Kickstarter.
There's Kickstarter after Kickstarter for this.
And Eric, you hit a very interesting point, which is that community is hitting an area that Games Workshop hasn't produced. Most of the terrain Games Workshop produces is Imperial. And Brian has an awesome looking Eldar table that he's put together, but it's all using the wood MDF boards, but it looks amazing. Brian's looks incredible. It actually got me to buy a bunch of MDF, and then I was like, I hate working with this stuff.
Yeah, it's not fun.
But for years we were like, gosh, I'd love to fight over a battle over an area that wasn't a ruined Imperial City,
right?
And the fact is now you can.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
And you can also hit all the historicals if you're looking for, sort of an Imperial Guard feeling thing. I've got some old like World War II coastal bunkers that look great if you pack them full of Acadians. So there's a lot of things like that where you can think about adding things. There's tons of trench lines. Like building a trench board is really hard if you're doing it with foam and popsicle sticks. It's not very hard if you're just 3D printing chunks of trench together.
And there is Kickstarter after Kickstarter for people that develop STLs. It's just the files. You pay $50, you get like a huge amount of variety of what you're trying to do. It's honestly, it's one of the best purchases I've made for miniature wargaming is that 3D printer.
Yeah, I've got so for example, I've got a board right now that's a crashed void ship that like you're fighting over the wrecked skeleton of what is if you're in Adeptus Titanicus scale, because I emailed the guy because I'm on his Patreon and I asked him to make a scale agnostic version of it. So if you're in sort of AT-18 scale, it's like some sort of Imperial frigate. If you're in 40K scale, it's like an Imperial shuttle, but that's because ships are huge. And like I've got one of those. I've got 3D Alien Worlds, who also makes Necron and Eldar terrain. I bought a bunch of their files for essentially a Imperial Japanese style castle that I'm working on for a sort of Fall of the Inner Palace on Terra heresy board. Because or if I someday have a samurai game.
I just saw their site, and wow, their stuff is pretty cool.
Yeah, their stuff is great. And so I eventually the plan is to have a full 6x4 table of sort of this inner garden of the palace that Rogel Dorn hasn't ruined yet. That's this contrast of, serene and dignified, and then there's going to be blood splatter. And you can do things like that doesn't have Games Workshop terrain. And ironically, I think one of the places 3D printers do the worst is trying to mimic Games Workshop terrain.
Yeah.
Because filament printers are not injection molded machines.
Right.
And so trying to get all the little spiky spires that almost take your eye out when you're trying to move units around and things like that, they're not really very good at those. And so I think the sort of direct emulation of the Cities of Death kit is what they used to be called. I don't know what they're called anymore. But that type of terrain, I think it doesn't lend itself particularly well to that. And there's this just whole other universe of terrain to make that. Yeah, you can be fighting over Tau Sept worlds and Necron Tomb worlds, and you don't have to worry about why my Necron fat mat has a bunch of Imperial terrain on it. Just put a bunch of obelisks and nonsense on it. And I think that's terrain. I will drop a note that on the sort of smaller scale for hopefully someday Epic, Adeptus Titanicus, and Aeronautica, resin printers also do a good job of terrain there. Because they're smaller. I will say that resin printers struggle with terrain for two reasons. One is just terrain is big. And so if you're printing it out of resin, it gets expensive. And at that point, you might as well buy a plastic kit.
Yeah.
And the other thing is a lot of terrain is flat and is meant to be flat because filament printers like flat bases. Because essentially it has to stick to the base of the printer. Resin printers hate flat bases. They would much prefer sort of organic shapes and things like that. So resin printers struggle with that a little bit, but at smaller scales, they work really well. So there's lots of Adeptus Titanicus terrain for things like airfields and little bunkers. There's a site, Grimdark Terrain, that makes great sort of Adeptus Titanicus feeling terrain. Like they've got an airfield set I'm printing right now because I want my Titans to fight over an airfield. And they've got a lot of stuff like that. They've got a lot of little scatter terrain and things like that. So one of my complaints about AT-18 is you have these wrecked cities that have nothing else in them except Titans. Here you can print a lot of ruined tanks, blown up little Lehman Russes, things like that. That again is great for filament printers. Resin printers.
The other point you made, just real quick, I want to touch on is, Eric, you were talking about how the filament printer lays down each layer. And you're saying, it melts it, and then it cools, and now you have plastic. I would add to that, if you listen to that description, you don't get the sense that the stuff you are printing on this is really durable. Like that PLA is actually quite durable. That terrain is very durable. You can drop it, and it will not break. So, I just want to add that in. It's also just, at first I was concerned, I didn't know the fragility of it, and it is not. It is not fragile.
Yeah, it's honestly pretty bomb-proof.
Yeah, Carl, the stuff that I remember there was when I was at your place last time, there was like a black. You printed out it looked like some sort of like a fantasy
cathedral.
Yeah, I remember looking at that thing and it looked phenomenal. And with some of those lines, I've done it in the past where, there's some 3D printed stuff that I bought off of eBay a while ago, and I remember the lines were not great, and I remember seeing a trick, and I'm not sure if I'm just. I feel like a kid who just got done playing with, matches and a drum of gasoline going, was this dangerous? But I know
what you're going to say.
Well, I was using like acetone and a rag, right? Yep. To sort of smooth the stuff out. I don't know if I was just huffing pure cancer, but it more or less did the trick on some larger surfaces that I needed to. I put
there's been a lot of ways people do that, or they, build a box that they can have that in. I'm not going to screw around with that kind of thing. That's not dangerous to me.
Yeah,
I get the results I need from what I'm printing. I'm very, very happy with the results, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. It is definitely dangerous,
right?
Because it involves the word vaporized acetone. And that's never good.
Acetone.
But yeah, and there are ways to do it. So, Brian, you've been talking about this for other things. Automotive filler primer.
Yeah.
Will cover up some of those layer lines. If you really want to go at it, sanding will work. Badger, for their airbrushes, sells a primer system they call 3D Prime. I'm not convinced it works, but I use it. That's essentially a pre-coat primer that helps hide some of the layer lines. I think a lot of it honestly is based on painting. That you can hide a lot of those lines with painting.
Yeah.
It involves changing some of your techniques. Ink washes don't work great necessarily because they'll follow those layer lines with capillary action.
Right.
But an airbrush where you just like use an ink to just put a sort of brownish patina over things. So I don't use washes, but I tend to use a lot of airbrushed inks, weathering powders.
Yeah.
You do a lot of weathering powders. And by the time you've added enough sort of visual interest to glue things over it. So like one thing I've been doing a lot is I've taken little resin bits and glued them to filament printed terrain for the detailed little, like an exhaust fan and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Once you've done all that, your eye's not going to notice the layer lines anymore. Yeah. Especially once you put that on a battlefield.
Right.
And you put, a bunch of Crimson Fists on top of it, that's not what your eye's going to be drawn to anymore. The one thing is that washes don't work.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the thing with terrain is that washes are. I whenever I watch those videos and they're like, yeah, and we just mixed up, a vat of wash and we're going to apply this to an entire. I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Painting terrain is, from a technique standpoint, is so much about when you paint a miniature, you're trying to direct the eye. I mean, that's why you use like spot colors. That's why you want to highlight the face more. You're directing the eye to that, and then that way you don't have to do as much. But with terrain, it's so much more important, and you have to remember you don't want, even on a big flat surface, sometimes you want to not put as much variation if it's a smaller model so that you can suggest scale. But if you're looking at things like you have to spray, like Carl with your Zone Mortalis stuff, like you have to spray in some variation in that, because if it's all just a flat gray, it starts looking really small on a big model like that. And so,
and let me tell you, Brian, for the listeners, Brian knows what he's talking about. Like when it comes to terrain, Brian, like I said, I paid not an insignificant amount to have you paint, not an insignificant amount of house terrain, but I couldn't be happier with the results. You really are. The techniques you're talking about totally work. You're 100% right.
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say is that when you're mentioning, especially if you're airbrushing with shading the thing and sort of shooting shadows, I like with yours. A thing that I did too was you don't have to use using pure ink. I think is a little bit of a trap, or even like thinning it down. Like you can mix a little bit of paint into it also. Like a couple of drops of black, like if you're using like an umber ink or something like that, you can put like a couple of drops of black into it and then thin both of those down. And you get this sort of like universal grime shading layer, if you're doing like a Zone Mortalis thing or Ruined Imperial Cities and things like that. And that's really going to help to do that. And even like on my Eldar stuff, like I sprayed some of that lightly over big flat surfaces. Cause if it was just this big white shiny, Eldar, or definitely not IP infringing, not Eldar landing pad thing, like it's going to look weird. It's going to look like a toy. And so you want to give it a little bit of that realism to do that. So just like, don't be afraid to play around with mixing. You can mix paint and ink. I mean, it's just pigment suspended differently. And when you put something in it, another medium in it to sort of thin it down a little bit, it becomes this whole new thing that you can do.
The best part is if you mess up on terrain, you just keep painting.
Right. You just keep doing it.
Keep going.
Yeah. You pull out a brush that you can also paint a room with and you fix it, with some dry brushing or whatever it is. So yeah, God damn it. Now I want to paint some terrain. All right.
I confess
it's relaxing.
Yeah.
I have walked into my closet of shame and occasionally gone, I wonder if I could just pay Brian to deal with some of this terrain.
Closet up.
Yes, the closet of opportunity. But yeah, I love terrain. Like I have said that if I could take like 3 years off and just paint terrain, I would do it. I love terrain. It's incredibly relaxing.
Turns out staying home during COVID was not the solution to painting all my stuff that wasn't painted. I just had the time to do this. Turns out not true.
No.
Not true.
Yeah, there's two types of hobbyists in COVID. The ones who got a bunch of stuff done and the ones who got absolutely nothing done. I keep getting tagged on Twitter on like, post your 4 favorite models that you painted in the last month. And I'm like, August of last year, I painted this one dude. I like him.
Right.
He's good.
Back to printers.
Yeah, so back to printers. Moving on, the next sort of thing you can do with printers is obviously printing figures themselves. And this is where resin printers come into their own, because again of those layer lines that filament printers do, is you can, with those, you lose a bunch of detail. If you're talking about 5 lines that make up somebody's face, you're not going to be able to, make out eyes and, facial features and things like that. The filament printers struggle with sort of long, narrow pieces because essentially the plastic keeps remelting. So, wizard staffs and stuff like that struggle.
Yeah.
There are definitely figures that you can make with filament printers. There are, again, whole Kickstarters of models that are built for it, but you have to really think about it. Whereas resin printers, this is really where resin printers come into their own. And again, as we talked about the obvious sort of IP elephant in the room, there is like, I painted a whole army. And yeah, you can do that. I think a lot of the potential here is for either painting sort of single figures or small groups. So I want a really cool looking commissar or inquisitor, or I want this sort of monster for this one encounter. Like I want, a Necromunda thing where some monsters come out of the Underhive and is killing everybody. Great for stuff like that. Great for skirmish games. Like there's tons of Vikings on various things. So like if you want to play Saga, just print yourself a Saga Warband and you'll be fine. As we mentioned, there's also the potential for things like abandoned games. So things like if you're playing Epic, if you're playing Battlefleet Gothic, if you are looking for bits for games that are supported. So things like Adeptus Titanicus, there's some folks who have been making all the really old stuff from the original version of Adeptus Titanicus. So like there has been a reference since the Warlord came out of essentially a repurposed industrial cutting laser as one of its weapons that Games Workshop has just never made it. Somebody made a version of it for the Adeptus Titanicus scale Warlords. Or there's the really old weapon that was just like really just a fist with a bunch of Space Marines inside that you'd sort of crash it into another Titan and then the Space Marines would board. They have made essentially a boarding thing for that. So you can get some things like that. And I think that's where this really comes into its own for sort of the Games Workshop part of the hobby, is using resin printers to print off those sort of one-off type of models, or things where you're talking about genuinely abandoned lines. So like I've printed some wrecked Thunderbolts for Adeptus Titanicus to put on bases and things like that, where I think it works well.
Eric, please tell me, I love the ridiculousness of 80s and 90s games like Titanicus with their origins. Please tell me this Warlord fist loaded with Space Marines is called something ridiculous like the I don't know, Turbo Cestus Ram
I believe it was
something.
Originally called the Cestus Ram.
Okay, there we go.
I believe that is where
called the Adeptus Fist of Fury.
Yeah, like,
I'm just
and yes, I own the file. My second Warlord is going to be a ridiculous. This isn't actually legal. I'm going to claim this is a power fist and a volcano cannon or something. Just because, like, and they're sewn pieces like the old ones. You could have like landing pads on the top. So one of them is a landing pad, a Space Marine land speeder on it. It's just goofy stuff that Forge World's got enough on its plate.
Yeah,
that they're never going to get around to like wacky callback bits with no rules.
Right.
Although, like, I'm pretty sure the guys at Forge World just heard the phrase wacky callback bits with no rules and like had a little wistful sigh. But like that kind of stuff, basing material, things like that are great uses for figures. I, as we have probably figured out from the first episode of the show, really like narrative gaming. I have a bunch of 3D printed sort of Warhammer NPC weirdos for like, you have to escort the rogue trader off the ship before they get captured. Objective markers. Resin 3D printed stuff makes great objective markers.
Yeah.
Things like that to sort of bring new stuff to the game. I think honestly one of the places that it's served the most poorly and is possibly really inefficient is I'm just going to print an army.
Yeah.
I think that's actually sort of that sounds. I love my 3D printers, and that sounds incredibly tedious and not like something I'm interested in.
Yeah, so you're mentioning the Dead Game support, and Battlefleet Gothic is the one, and not just because, I mean, Eric, you printed out the one ship. I have like a really big Imperial fleet that's painted up, and the one ship that I didn't have was sort of like the ship, right? I'm a cruiser guy. Like, I like to just swamp the board with cruisers. I get that escorts are more efficient. I get that, you know, carriers are great. Ordnance slows the game down. I just want to ram ships into other ships and shoot giant frickin' space lasers. And I'm like, hey, I lined up that once in a lifetime shot and I get to roll 18 dice on weapon batteries. I don't care that I'm rolling against sixes. I get to roll 18 dice. Like, I'm one of those players with it. But with Battlefleet Gothic, you run into the problem. I mean, the ships are ridiculously expensive to buy, the legit ones. And when you go to buy metal ones on eBay, I've ordered some where there was one where it was no, it wasn't my Eldar battleship. It was one of the ones that I ordered, and I was like, oh man, this is a hard to get one. This is cool. Like, I got a pretty decent price on it. And when it showed up in the box that thing would have shown up in. The plastic was off of it, and the metal was pretty clearly not the original, you know, lead pewter or whatever the deal was. Because people have actually gone back and recast a lot of those metal ships because they can, you know, make some sort of a weird living on it. And you can tell because, like, the different pieces will age completely differently from each other. Like, you know, because the tin content's a little off and whatever the deal is. So the nice thing is, you know, like this Emperor Titan or Emperor battleship, if I tried to buy one of those, people on eBay are trying to sell those things. And these are like ones that it's a terrible design. It's like split in the middle and it's a giant, you can like kill a child with this it's so heavy. And you'll see ones that are like broken in half and painted and just jacked up. And people want like $100 for these things, you know? And so that was a ship that I just told myself, I just can't justify it mentally, like paying that much for an old ship. But so it's not just those where you can like, oh, that's a hard to get model. I can do that. Where it really excels is like, Eric, you printed out some of the transport ships for me that are used in very specific like narrative missions. And also there are some ones that are fire ships, which are ones that you use in like these ones where you're sort of attacking. These are ships that you can ignite, but they're only used in some of the missions. And they did make these models back in the day, but not everybody thought to do them. You know, so like with me, like I have every Eldar Corsair ship that's been made except for the 2 Forge World light cruisers and those types of things. Because back in the day I was like, you know, they're pretty good, but I just don't play enough to really justify it. Now I'm like, I should have bought 5, you know. And printers can allow you to do that and go back and sort of backfill these things because people are charging a fortune for these on eBay, and they're real, you know, you're not, a lot of the time you're getting recasts anyways of those things.
Yeah, or like I have a Space Marine battle barge from the original one, which again is another child-killing metal model.
Right.
It's got all the little narrow things that bend no matter what you do. Yeah. Because you've got a metal model sitting on a bunch of really narrow pieces. I think the other thing that you mentioned is good for this is similarly, I wanted to do a terrain piece that's an objective marker with a little like Auspex scan of an Imperial ship to make it look like we're being boarded and we've scanned the ship that's boarding us, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to use a Battlefleet Gothic ship to do that because now that's like a $50 objective marker.
Right.
There's no way I'm sacrificing a perfectly good, escort for that.
Yeah.
But also, and this is again a call out to the Soulforge. Yeah, that thing.
Yeah. Carl's just thing I'd point out, holding it up to your camera, you can see how this is not straight.
Yeah, right. That's not straight anymore.
No way to straighten it because it's metal.
Yeah.
Space Marine. Excellent radio. Carl has one of the
I know it's terrible.
Space Marine battle barges, and yeah, it's bent. It could kill a small child. But I think one of the other cool things is that to again call out the Soulforge Studio guys who have been doing a lot of this is you've also got the ability to sort of remix those things because they're just 3D images. So, the Battlefleet Heresy guys who have been doing Horus Heresy era Battlefleet Gothic, where all the fleets are sort of mixed up, you can start saying, I'm going to put an Imperial Prow on what is in the 40K universe a a definitely chaos ship.
Right, like a Desolator or an Infidel or
a Desolator or something like that. We can stick an Imperial Prow on it.
Yeah.
We can make, Battle Barge at that time was a really nebulous term.
Right.
So we can make those look more like Imperial Navy ships, or we can make them look more like the Battle Barges, or, Games Workshop, because at the time they were very big on the options that didn't have models. There's all kinds of things you can replace the prow of a thing with. You can actually get those prows.
Right.
So you can have a battle barge with the boarding torpedoes, or a battle barge with the hangar bays, or with the bombardment cannon, and you just swap those out. And you go, I want it to look a little bit more Imperial Fisty, or like I want it to look like Iron Warriors. So of course they've got hazard stripes on the prow, even though the thing's like 14 kilometers long. It doesn't need hazard stripes. We know it's dangerous. You can do all those things and sort of remix them in ways that I think has brought a lot of creativity to that. And again, a lot of accessibility. Like I've actually started looking at like, oh man, I could, on the same trip I managed to play Kill Team with Carl, I could go play, Battlefleet Gothic with Brian.
Yeah.
I'm not going to spend $500 buying an Imperial fleet for Battlefleet Gothic.
No.
And tracking down and like camping eBay for the one Dauntless I still need.
Right.
Like that's just not going to happen. So with those band games, I think that's really helped keep that community alive. Mm-hmm. Especially with those narrative ships, because those were niche when they came out. Yeah. So like the number of super heavy Battlefleet Gothic transports in the world has got to be a really, really depressingly small number.
I have a bunch of them, because when I bought my my Minotaurs from Ed Brown, who used to work at Forge World, he had a whole Minotaurs fleet as well. And so he's like, oh, I'll just send this over to you too. And then he had like this whole just box of just bits for Battlefleet Gothic that I have. Brian, I'll happily let you dig through and take a look next time you're over, because you might find some interesting stuff in there. Space stations and all kinds of stuff.
Wow.
Yep. Or there's the like old defense monitors and things like that that are like, you bought this for one cool scenario, maybe.
Right.
Those ships are now really hard to find. So the third thing that I wanted to talk about, which is I think, again, back in the realm of the filament printers are really good for this, is what I call utility prints, which is just things that make your hobby life easier. So I have 3D printed brush holders. I've 3D printed some stuff to sort of organize things. I have a whole array of essentially paint holders that hold the dropper paint bottles at a 45-degree angle that are designed to fit perfectly in the shelves that I store them in, because I designed it. So I sort of custom made them to fit right, that I got really extra and printed them in the appropriate filament color for the color the paint is, so that for a brief and shining moments in time before I actually started painting, I was organized. There's things like that. I've made various things to like help hold airbrush stuff. So I've got a little sort of a thing with a thumb pad that then has a long sort of hockey stick shaped thing so that I can hold a piece in front of the airbrush and not have my hand there. That took 10 minutes to design and probably 15 minutes to print. And I just printed like 30 of them and have been slowly going through them with things. Things like that, that sort of things that make your hobby life easier. I have a cup that I sort of made look like a gear to make it seem somewhat 40K-ish. That's perfectly designed for a bottle of Nuln Oil or Agrak Earthshade, so you can stop spilling them on your goddamn tables. Just print one, and it'll stabilize it, and you can stop posting those pictures on Facebook. Those sorts of things are, you can just make them.
Can you print out a box that automatically locks with your phone inside when Nuln Oil hits your desk, so that it doesn't open for 24 hours, so you don't take a picture of it, because absolutely nobody gives a fuck about that?
Or for example, with your Emperor class battleship.
Yes.
I had no idea how I was going to ship that, and then I just printed a box for it and just said, I'm just gonna make a box that's the right size so that it's a hard case protecting the soft foam.
Nice.
And I went a little bit extra and printed the Emperor Protects on top in a different color filament.
That is way overkill, but it's fun.
Yeah, it's way overkill.
It was hilarious. I opened up the box and I'm like, "What in the fuck is it?" I
it's
slid it
cool.
open and I'm like, "Oh, that's so great."
Yeah,
That's cool.
I printed those. I've got a similar one for cards, for like Adeptus Titanicus or Stratagem cards or things like that you can sort of pop your faction logo on if you're feeling, again, a little bit extra or not. And those types of things I found have just made sort of my hobby life slightly easier. So like I don't really like the GW paint handle, and I found it sort of hard to find. I just printed one that's just essentially a column and then a thing that push fits the right size thing on. So then I can take it off and just put another model on there and have them just live on there.
Nice.
Relatively easy things like that. There's what's it called? Tinkercad is free really to use online CAD software that
it's pretty quick to learn too.
It's pretty quick to learn, and as long as you're just like, I want a box with a triangle on top, is really pretty easy and pretty straightforward. That I've done a bunch of stuff. I've actually remixed some terrain stuff. Like 3D kit bashing was a really weird thing to do, but I have one piece of terrain that I took one model and said I want room for another model inside it, so carve it out. And stuff like that has worked really well. And so that's I think the third thing for it is those utility prints, both sort of in your hobby, and then of course invariably once you have a 3D printer, you start going, I could 3D print something for that. And so I've got like my Mac Mini is currently in a vertical stand because I printed a vertical stand for it, and I've got some sort of weird USB stick SD card holder, stuff like that you just start going like, oh yeah, I could do that. Recently in my paint room, I had to print essentially some props for something that because I'll post pictures of this eventually, but my airbrush station is very improvised, and I needed to support an airbrush booth on something, so I just designed something and printed it. And I was like, I'm not in the rest of my life a really handy person. So I just said, essentially, I'm going to print this. And then I did that, and I was like, oh, is this what people who have like miter saws and know what to do with that feel like all the time? That they're just like, oh yeah, I could just build something for that. I'm like, is that why they're so smug? Because this feels really good. And my wife was like, yes, that's exactly how that works.
It is. Yeah, that is exactly why. So, and that was the thing I was going to try to bring up is I hear Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park in my head. I mean, you do have to be careful with some of these things, because I've seen people post stuff, and again, you do your thing, but I've seen some people post some stuff where I'm like, you printed a 3D holder that holds the lid open. Like, you do know on the paint tabs, there's like a little thing you can push in. And I responded with a video of me opening it up with my thumb and pushing it while I was holding the camera in the other hand. I'm like, you don't need to like 3D print a Kanban board to try to organize your bullshit sometimes. So you sometimes you do have to ask yourself, sometimes you can be a little preoccupied with whether you could and not whether you should with some of them, but I don't know.
There is definitely an aspect of a solution in search of a problem.
Right.
3D prints, find a way.
Right. Printers will find a way to keep that thing buzzing and rolling all night long. So
it's a great tool. I'm glad I got one.
Yeah.
Eventually I'll get a resin one. Eric, we should talk.
Yeah.
Which one I should get.
Yeah. Well, Carl, you're kind of up against the clock here on time.
Yes.
So why don't we take a break here? On the other side, we'll go ahead and talk about models for getting started. Carl, thanks for coming on. Like I'm telling you, man, I don't think you were ever on Splinter Mine.
I could be wrong.
I seriously don't. Well, no, because you and Josh were like two people locally that I just never had on, and I was like, just the topic and time didn't come up whenever something happened. So,
yeah, I mean, I would frequently have people ask, "Oh, can I come be a guest on the independent characters?" And I'd be like, "Well, I have the correct guest on for the correct topic." I mean, that was kind of my thing, and sometimes timing doesn't work out or whatever, so that's fine.
Yeah. No, sometimes there'd be the topic, but then, something would come up where it's like, oh, we have to bump that, and then it would get bumped for a while because stuff would come out, and yeah. I'd make it
like
a lot
the
of
Matt Damon of Splinter Mine from Jimmy Kimmel saying, "Oh, sorry, we had to bump Matt Damon."
Oh, I'm gonna have to look that up. I don't know that reference.
You're not familiar with this?
Oh, no.
It's a good running gag. I'll send you over some stuff.
Well, cool. Well, Carl, thanks for coming on. And
guys, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you, Carl.
Yeah. Eric, enjoy your new Kill Team set.
Thank you.
Oh,
yeah, no.
I said, do I need to give him your address? And he goes, no, I got it.
Yes, Sky's got me dialed in.
So that'll be on the way. That solves the problem for me too.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, from your closet of opportunity to mine.
That's right.
And Eric, I'm telling you, when the next one comes out with stuff that I want in it, we're gonna have Carl back on. He can send that one to me.
Yeah, there you go.
It's too bad you didn't want Gray Knights. I just want that sorcerer from the Thousand Suns.
Yeah. And Sky wouldn't even have to. Sky wouldn't have to ship it to me. He's like 12 minutes from my door. So.
There you go.
All right, Carl. Well, thanks for coming. And man,
sorry to pill on you guys.
No worries. Thanks,
oh
Carl.
no, man. Life is life. Okay, and to close out this topic on 3D printing, let's talk about actually getting into it. Like, what do you need to buy? What are what are things you have to consider getting in? So I'm going to be playing interviewer on this one because I have absolutely no experience at all with 3D printing. Where do you start?
So that's a really good question, and the answer is there's a lot of resources to start with. I think the first thing is there's a lot of internet resources to learn about this and sort of, think about it while you're doing it. On Variance Hammer, I'm going to be writing, hopefully before this comes out, a guide to this that gets into the weeds a little bit more on some of these topics. And then YouTube is really, really good for learning how to get started, how to deal with your printer, reviews of printers. There's a couple YouTubes I like. 3D Printing Pro is really good for resin printers, and then Maker's Muse and 3D Printing Nerd are really good for filament printers, sort of looking at. But there's a lot, and you can just, if you honestly Google 3D printing wargaming on YouTube, you'll get a lot. In terms of sort of how you think about buying printers, the first thing I want to say is, and I think Brian will agree with this, the best 3D printer you can get is your friend already owns one.
Absolutely.
And just ask them, hey, can you print this thing for me? If you're interested in getting into it and you want your own because you're tired of asking Eric to print Battlefleet Gothic ships for you, hey, what one do you own? Do you like that experience? What are some of the caveats with it? Things like that. So, but really, the best 3D printer is the one your friend already owns. But if you want your own, I sort of divide things into two categories, what I call the budget version and what I call the Apple version. And the Apple version is for the sort of higher end, probably not as great a value, but has that premium of it just works to it. For FDM printers, classically, the one that's used by miniatures folks a lot is what's called the Creality Ender 3. It's made by a Chinese company called Creality. And that is admittedly a little bit of the printer is now your hobby. It's cheap. It's got a lot of community support behind it, and you can get really good quality prints out of it, but you're going to fiddle with it. You're going to print add-ons for it. You're going to buy upgrade parts, things like that. It's a tinkerer's machine, but you can get a lot out of it. On the other end of FDM printers is the one Carl has, which is also the one I have, which is the Prusa Mark III. It's now the Mark III S Plus. That is especially if you buy this, if it's a complicated kit, if you buy it as a kit, if you buy it as an assembled version, it's a box that you open and then put on your table. Wow. You could buy somewhere between 3 and 4 Ender 3s for that price, but literally was up and printing in 20 minutes. And that printer is absolutely a workhorse. I've currently got a second filament 3D printer that I'm reviewing by a company called Lulzbot. That's sort of an American company that's making what they're hoping is a competitor to this with, again, good customer support. That's one of the things that comes with the more expensive printers is actually being able to talk to a person, having less reliance, but still all 3D printers do rely on like Facebook groups for that printer to do a lot of sort of diagnostics and fixing. But that's sort of the Apple version I would go with, is probably a Prusa. There's a couple other companies that are sort of in the running for that. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was going to say, so if we're looking at this budget version versus an Apple version for getting started, what is the price range on those? I mean, I understand obviously they're going to keep getting cheaper as time goes on. The higher end ones the quality will improve. The price will probably stay the same. But what are we looking at today in 2021 for these?
Yeah, that's a valid question. So the Ender 3, the low end version, is now $150 to start with. Like, I'm sure there's shipping added onto that. So let's say 200 all told with a thing of filament.
Wow.
A Prusa Mark III fully assembled is about $1,200. So there is a significant price gap. The low spot I mentioned, the Sidekick is the name of the printer, will be in that same price range. You're talking about the low sort of single thousands. You can get more expensive from there. I think all of those, once you get past there, you're adding things that won't matter for our hobby. You're talking about being able to print exotic filaments that you shouldn't be printing anyway.
Right.
Things like that, or really huge build volumes where wargaming stuff just isn't that big.
Yeah.
So I don't think you need to go much past there, but that's sort of what we're talking about is that price range. The $1,200 one also comes with a roll of filament. They throw that in for free.
And for $1,200, we'll throw a roll in.
Yeah, the nice part about that one is literally you're up and printing in 20 minutes. They calibrate it at their factory. So like it's set up correctly for all the various things that have to happen. So it's just a really easy experience for that. As Carl said, that I don't want this to be my hobby.
Yeah.
I just want to set it on a table, tell it to print, and away we go.
Now, as far as like a physical footprint for this, how much room are you going to need dedicated for this?
Probably. So mine's on a little like kitchen cart.
Okay.
They're not very big. I will say that sort of the middle range between those two is what's called the Prusa Mini, which is sort of a small bed printer. The tricky part with filament printers is a bunch of this stuff for it. The motors that drive the print head itself, the electronics, things like that, those don't scale as your printer gets bigger and smaller. Those are sort of the same size. So it's harder to get much smaller than sort of a couple feet by like 2 feet by 2 feet.
Got it. But
they don't take up a lot of room. So the one I'm testing, for example, is living on my painting desk right now, fairly unobtrusively.
Got it.
They can be noisy. So like I wouldn't put it next to where I was, and they can vibrate. So I wouldn't put it next to where I was like painting while I was painting.
Right.
But they're relatively unobtrusive. They're desktop sized.
Yeah, this isn't going to be in your bedroom while you're trying to sleep.
No, don't put this in your bedroom. First of all, because you are melting plastic, there are fumes that come out from it. They are not for the filament that most hobbyists print on, which is called PLA, which is polylactic acid. The filaments isn't toxic enough to like definitely need ventilation or anything like that, but it's putting it like it does smell. Like I can't smell anything. I've never been able to smell anything. My wife will walk into my printing room and be like, "I smell burning plastic," and the answer is, "Yep, I am burning plastic." The one note of caution that we didn't mention that I meant to when Carl mentioned the durability of sort of 3D printed terrain, do not leave it in a car. Exactly like dogs and children, if you leave it in a car on a hot day, it will die.
Wow.
The reason it's easy to print with is because it's got a fairly low melting temperature. So importantly, the glass temperature, which is where it starts to be able to conform to things, for PLA is about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which a car on a hot day can get there.
Oh yeah, easily.
Yeah. So if you drive to a tournament and leave it in your car, you could melt your terrain. Don't do that. But for example, because I'm a huge nerd, I put a digital thermometer in my garage during the heat wave to find out if I could safely store things in the garage. I have graphs to prove that yes, I can.
Okay.
So just don't leave it in your car. Occasionally, people get the genius idea to like 3D print cup holders. Not a genius idea.
A little coffee cup koozie, not so much.
Yeah, it doesn't go good. So similarly, for resin printers, you have, again, the budget version and the Apple version. Now, the difference between these is a lot less. But importantly, the innovation here is a lot faster. So I'm not going to recommend a particular printer as much as some brands. So on the budget end of things, Anycubic, which is just Anycubic, and a company called Elegoo, Elegoo, make good printers. What you're looking at right now is printers that have 4K resolution. So this is, when I mentioned cell phone screens is a part of this, it is literally on an LCD screen. They used to be just the ones we could get for phones. Now there's ones that are specifically made for 3D printing. So they're better. But what you're looking for is what's called a mono screen, which is just black and white instead of a multicolor LCD screen, because you don't need that. So those print faster and the highest resolution you can get, because that means it's better detailed. There are now both sort of small resin printers that have essentially a 5-inch print bed or thereabouts to them, and larger ones that have like a 10-inch or a foot one. I will say I don't own one of the larger ones. From talking to people and sort of watching people's experience online, those seem to be slightly harder to work with. And again, for a lot of what we do, people are talking about like, oh, I'll just print terrain on my resin printer that's big down. I'm not convinced that's a great use of them, but you can do it. The small ones I found are perfect for bits and Battlefleet Gothic ships and 8mm terrain and things like that. So the budget version, again, is Elegoo and Anycubic. You're sort of looking for whatever it's the Anycubic Photon and the Elegoo Mars, whatever the current newest version of that. I think it's the Mars 2 Pro or whatever by the time this comes out.
Yeah, on their site they have an Elegoo Mars 3 Ultra 4K Mono LCD 3D printer with 3 PCS FEP 2.0 film for $300.
Yes. There you go.
Okay.
There you go. That is at the time of recording what you want. Again, The resin printing market is moving very fast as people start making new screens and things like that. On the higher end version of things is a company called Epax. And that's a company that, again, is an American company. There you're looking at about $600 or $700 for sort of the comparable machine to that Elegoo machine we just talked about. That's the one I own. Again, that comes sort of pre-configured, so it is literally just sort of pour the resin in, hit print, and away you go. The material for it is a little bit more durable. So like the vat the resin goes in is all metal. The plate that comes down has like 4 points of securement instead of 1, so it's hard to knock it out of alignment. Things like that. The thing itself is all metal and has sort of a closable lid instead of just having an acrylic sort of hood that goes over it. Things that just feel like a slightly better build quality. That's the one I have. That's the sort of, again, the sort of it just works version. Again, you're looking at sort of $600 to $700. The current one for that is the Epax X1 4K is their newest one. That's the one I have. It's phenomenal. I love it. It is my precious child that prints amazing Battlefleet Gothic ships with little flying buttresses and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then there's all kinds of resins and stuff you can experiment with that are, these ones are really hard but sort of brittle. These ones are a little bit flexible. There's all kinds of stuff like that. Generally speaking, any of the sort of mainstream brands, again, so Anycubic, Elegoo, Epax, will work. My favorite resin right now is Epax Hard, but there's a lot to sort of experiment with there. But that really is sort of the span of it. And then again, going to YouTube, you can see reviews for these printers. For resin printers, again, 3D Printing Pro will reviews every resin printer under the sun, has pictures of miniatures printed with each of them, reviews resin. So sort of the video that originally sold me on the Epax was a video by him where he was just like, this is now my mainline printer. And I was like, fair enough. This is now my mainline printer. So yeah, that's really where we're at. But that's sort of the span of prices. So for resin printers, again, it's much more narrow. What gets expensive for resin printers is as you start looking at the much larger form factor printers. Those get expensive because, again, now we're talking about custom LCD screens and things like that. The price of those starts going up. And if you're just getting started, I don't know that that's where I'd start.
Yeah, the low end one that I was looking up there, the $300 one, I was like, that's not that big. And that's, but again, at my place, it would be a space issue more than anything. But
yeah, it's not that big. That is, for example, that's the size of my printer. You can, if you're careful, pack an entire Space Marine battle barge worth of prints onto a single print bed. I will say the other thing that will add a little bit of cost to that is both Elegoo and Anycubic. Epax doesn't sell one of these, but you can buy an adapter that's easy enough. Have what are called a wash and cure station, which is basically a base that's about the size of your printer, a bucket, and a cover. And the bucket has a magnetic agitator in it. What you do is you fill the bucket with isopropyl alcohol. There's a mechanism to secure your build plate to the isopropyl to the bucket. You press a button, it washes it. You take it out. You replace the bucket with a little acrylic plate that will rotate. You put it on there. You hit cure instead of wash, and it cures it for you as sort of a quality of life thing, because you're in the Bay Area. I'll just put it out in the sun isn't necessarily a reliable decision for you. I'm in a place that's cold a lot of the year, so we get sun, but I don't want to just be sticking stuff out in snowdrifts.
Right.
So I have one of those. Those are usually again, we're talking about $200, something like that. It's just a quality of life improvement. You end up not having to touch stuff.
Yeah.
The bucket of now toxic isopropyl alcohol is just contained in a bucket. And those are, again, either Elegoo or Anycubic sell those, and they're great.
Now, is there any specific disposal of that then for that isopropyl alcohol? I mean, can you?
Yeah. So the answer is do not put it down the sink. So isopropyl alcohol is itself not supposed to go down the sink. Isopropyl alcohol with uncured resin is really not supposed to go down the sink. What I do is generally the sort of accepted way to do this is you once that isopropyl alcohol gets cloudy, which means it's got a fair amount of undissolved resin in it, I pour it into a different container so that I can go back to using my bucket for what it's supposed to do. And then I let it sit for about a week. And basic chemistry, all the heavy resin will sink to the bottom and the isopropyl alcohol will sit on top. You can pour out most of that isopropyl alcohol and use it again, which is nice. It has been nice in the pandemic because isopropyl alcohol has been hard to find.
Right.
And not the pandemic, isopropyl alcohol is kind of expensive. So you can pour out probably 90% of that, and what you'll get at the bottom is very cloudy isopropyl alcohol. And then I just literally leave that out to sit for a couple days in the sun. The isopropyl alcohol evaporates off, and the resin at the bottom cures. And once it's cured, it's just plastic, and you can throw it away.
Oh, okay. Got it. Makes sense. Wow. I don't know why. It still scares me.
It's a lot of work. It has now become a routine for me, so it's not a big thing.
Right.
But it is more work, and it is a larger footprint. I've been enjoying it because I can do wacky Adeptus Titanicus terrain.
Sure.
But it's definitely more work. I think the thing I've said, and I have the series where I'm working on for Variance Hammer right now to accompany this has a graph for this. Resin printers are always a pain, but they are constantly just a pain. Filament printers, 95% of the time, are really easy to use.
Yeah.
And then when something goes wrong, a couple of the versions of this went wrong are just a huge pain.
Yeah.
That involves heat it up and pry the molten plastic off your machine while being very careful not to pull this one wire out.
Oh, wow.
That's just please no.
Yeah.
But that happens it's been a year since something like that happened on my filament printer. Mm-hmm. And I can count the number of times that has happened once on one hand. Whereas the number of times resin printers have been mildly annoying is literally every time. because like it is printing by dipping a metal plate in a vat of toxic. It does make you feel like a tech priest as you watch like stuff just emerge from the gray goo. But yeah, when it doesn't work, you start swearing in binaric.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, the first time you were describing it, I was like, this sounds like witchcraft. And yeah, it just reminds me of that meme of the tech priest, and it says for tech support, like, have you tried prayer?
And you do find people are super superstitious. Wow, that was hard to say, about their 3D printers. There's definitely there's a lot of received wisdom and things where it's like, oh yeah, no, you've got to do X before you do Y,
right,
to make sure it works okay.
Yeah.
That are always funny, because like you just see things and you're like, what do you have for evidence of that? And it's like nothing, but it works, so I do it.
It sounds like people in music where they talk about like your effects chain, signal chain. Like, okay, you have to put compressors first, then you have to put anything that changes pitch, then you have to put anything that would drive, and then you have to go modulation, and then you go with time, and then you'll get the other person who comes in and they're just like, no, you can put time at the beginning, because then if you put drive on the end, it does this magic thing. And yeah, tell a bass player that you put your compression at the end of the chain or at the beginning of the chain, and you'll find out what kind of a person they are pretty quickly, because they get very upset and very particular. I say why not both, but that's me. So before we go on to like further reading and other areas, you had a section in here on working with 3D printed models. You were mentioning with priming, you were mentioning the Badger makes a primer that you aren't completely sold on. You've tried using that. What's your experience been with it? Because Badger makes, I mean, their what is it? Their
Stynal Res.
Stynal Res. It's one of those primers that everybody just yells at me for not using, and I'm like, I don't do a lot of airbrush priming, but people that use it swear by it. What is there? I mean, of course, there isn't going to be consensus, because on the internet, the outliers are always going to be as loud as the majority. But what's sort of the verdict generally? I mean, is your experience with it different than what people have run into with it?
So no, I think that, I am a Stynal Res advocate. You should be using it if you do airbrush priming. For me, there's an article on Variance Hammer called The Great 3D Printing Prime Off. That is literally, I went sort of insane, printed a bunch of models, and then just tried to see what the best primer was. Because I was like, I'm embarking on this big terrain project. I don't want halfway through it to be like, oh man, I should have used the other primer. Generally speaking, the two things that are the thing that's advised is something like an automotive filler primer. Mm-hmm. My issue with that is that relies then on being sanded down,
right?
Which is great for certain types of terrain. So if you're printing like Necron terrain, spray it with filler primer and sand it is going to work great.
Right.
Maybe Eldar terrain where you've got a lot of smooth curves that you can get around with sandpaper. For your generic Imperial terrain, for rocks, for things like that, that's just never going to fly.
Yeah.
So when I was looking at sort of what primer can you use that will sort of get you there without a lot of prep work, I tried an automotive filler primer. I tried my go-to standard rattle can primer, which is Krylon, and I tried the Badger 3D Prime, either with their accompanying primer, which is, so there's basically an undercoat that's sort of a hazy white color that you put on. Like, what's funny about it is you don't follow any airbrush advice. They're like, you put it on heavy, and 3 coats. You just go to town.
Wow.
Because the idea is you're essentially putting goop on that's going to land in those crevices and sort of fill them out.
Sure.
I've tried that. They have an accompanying primer. I tried the 3D Prime sort of starter with both the 3D Prime primer and Stynal Res. I can't tell if there's a difference. My main conclusion was it doesn't matter. Prime with whatever you prime with.
Yeah.
All of them have worked for me. All of them seem to be equally durable. I was worried, will one of them not stick to that plastic? They all seem pretty durable. What determines whether you see layer lines is sort of the layer height you're using for the printer. So if you select a lower layer height, you will have harder to see layers, and it will take a lot longer to print. your paint job, and the design of the model itself.
Yeah.
There's lots of clever ways to hide layer lines, and then there's ways that will be visible. And there's, again, a lot of received lore about, oh, you use X, Y, and Z, and it'll hide the layer lines. I have yet to find a primer that, like, I had my wife do a blind, like, tell me which of these is the best, and she was like, I literally can't tell.
Yeah.
They're all gray.
Yeah, there was...
So, yeah.
I tried, so back in the day, I bought some stuff that was printed by, I think the company was like 3D Horizon Creations or something. It was a guy locally here that used to be in Boulder Creek that moved up to kind of Gold Country. But and I remember I tried using the filler primer that I used on the MDF stuff. There was another batch that I tried just using, oh God, the Rust-Oleum, it says like 2 times whatever, and I didn't notice much of a difference between the two at all with terrain, and those were some ones that had some pretty rough lines on them. As far as the resin stuff goes, like with the Primarks, that when I prime them, I just straight up used I use Duplicolor, which is an automotive primer that is very, very, it was one of those things that Jody turned me on to it locally, and I didn't want to try it because I was a Orchard, $2.99 a can guy until they died. And when I switched over to this stuff, like, it really does go. Recently I got Colin turned on to it. He was asking what I used for it, and it goes on very thin. And with the resin stuff, you don't know the resin stuff is quite a bit smoother. But I mean, I primed it in like the Battlefleet Gothic ships that I did, along with some metal ones, and you can't see the difference between them once it's on. So the resin stuff, you don't have to worry about the primer as much.
Exactly. I just use Stone Res out of an airbrush. Because and that is exactly like, and then I grab my Sisters of Battle and use Stynel Res out of an airbrush. I think for me, one of the risks with priming is when you're talking about trying to hide layer lines. Mm-hmm. What you're actually saying is, I want a primer that goes on heavy enough to start obscuring things.
Right.
We're talking about a hobby where there are small details.
Right.
So like the balance between hiding layer lines and not obliterating detail is, I think, really hard. And I think the answer is, once it's painted, I don't think you notice it.
Right.
Especially once it's on a table with models on it.
Yeah. So as far as resources getting out of here, you mentioned a few websites that we should just put those in the notes, in the show notes for or the show description. I did want to ask the question. So I'm always leery of going, when it comes to gaming things, of going to Facebook pages or those types of things. It's hard to find those groups because I always compare it to, I remember back in the Splinter Mind days, I talked about, you go into a grocery store and get on the PA system and say, I think my girlfriend might be the one. Should I marry her or not? The first 10 people that come running screaming to give you advice are probably the last people you should ever listen to. But are there any groups or forums that you can recommend for this? Or is it just video resources as far as finding that stuff out?
So video resources are a good start. I will say that one of the things I do recommend people do when they're thinking about buying a 3D printer is to find the official Facebook group for that 3D printer, mm-hmm. and just lurk for a bit. Because I found, for example, there are some more obscure printers where that group is just silent. And so if you're looking for help with that group, you're not going to get it because you've gone on the PA system at an abandoned store at 3 a.m. and said, hey, I think my girlfriend's the one.
Right.
On the other hand, there are groups that are sort of too big to be useful.
Yeah.
Or where the advice is sort of dominated by certain sort of in-group memes and jokes. One of my complaints about the Prusa group is that they're they skew a little bit that way. That there's sort of a common advice that they've just shorthanded into a particular GIF. They just, when you ask for advice, they post that GIF, and
got it.
If you're a new user, that's not as useful as I think they would like to tell themselves it is.
Right.
But there is the Facebook. Facebook is where I get most of my advice about 3D printing when I need something fixed. Generally speaking, I really like the official printer forums. They often have, or groups, I guess, they often have like the actual company there. Or very experienced users who will be like, yeah, that's how this works. For sort of groups beyond that, there's lots of 3D printing groups. I actually really like the Adeptus Titanicus one. I like the Battlefleet Gothic ones. The generic 3D printing for Warhammer 40k is absolutely full of people who are deep in the justification phase and absolutely convinced that any minute now Games Workshop is going to go out of business because I just bought a resin printer. I find their stuff less useful. Following particular creators is great too. So like Soulforge Studios has, if you're on their Patreon, they have a Discord. The Grimdark Terrain guy has a Discord. Those groups are really helpful because those are really committed, very passionate hobbyists. So you can be like, hey, like I did a thing where for this demo of this printer I'm doing, I posted on one of those groups, hey, does anyone have a recommendation for a good monster that works on filament printers? Because I just want to print a monster to see how it goes. And I got like 6 recommendations, all of which were great.
Cool.
So again, those are sort of like, you find those Discords, you get invited to those Discords on Patreons. I will say the way to buy most files, so how you find files, which is probably something we should cover, is the largest site for them is called Thingiverse. Again, we'll put all of these in the show notes, and I am going to write probably a series of posts on Variance Hammer about this. But then a lot of people have either Kickstarters or Patreons. I have come to prefer Patreons to Kickstarters. First of all, because I think it's helpful for creators to get a consistent amount of money month over month. But also I find Kickstarters really intimidating because suddenly I have 300 new files sitting on my downloads folder.
Yeah.
And I've got to sort them and figure them out. Whereas like this month we've come out with the, Chaos Space Marine Escorts. I'm like, great. I can just put those in a folder called Chaos Space Marine Escorts and I can be done.
Right.
But those are a really good resource. So it is social media. Sometimes the advice is not particularly helpful, but that is where the community advice does sort of live.
Yeah. Well, and also too, like you mentioned right at the beginning of this segment, the best one is the one that your friend already owns. So this is a lot like airbrushing where, if you go online, everybody's going to tell you, oh, you need to get this one, or this is a terrible airbrush. Well, I've heard some ones that people say, I've heard some people like the Badger, to use the example for people that are familiar with airbrushing, like, oh, the Badger Patriot Extreme is a pile of shit. And I'm like, it's a Badger Patriot with a better trigger is all that it is. The little wheel thing that people complain about, if you don't use it, it's not a thing. You know what I mean? So just finding, if you have, if you're lucky enough to have somebody in your area that has them. I mean, here in this area, we have a lot of people with them, but just see what people do. Ask questions because people clearly, it can be an involved hobby. So, I mean, people are going to want to talk about it if you engage with them.
And that's just helpful for like, hey, is this thing I'm doing, like, is this what I'm supposed to be seeing? Or is something wrong? Yeah. Because there's a lot of stuff where it's just like, you'll see it described on a website with a picture taken by a camera phone, and you're like, okay, but can someone actually show me what this looks like? So yeah, really, I do think the best printer is the one your friend already owns, both if you don't want to buy a printer and also if you do.
Right. Well, cool. Well, before we go, I mean, you were talking about, the group saying that, oh, well, I have a resin printer, so Games Workshop's going to go out of business. This was the one thing I wish I would have asked to get Carl's take on is, where do you think, I don't think this ends up going to where Games Workshop just, printers get so cheap and easy to use that Games Workshop just starts selling the files instead. But do you see companies like Forge World at some point switching over to using 3D printers for resin rather than just making things? Or do you think that the size of something like a Mastodon is so prohibitive that it still makes sense to try to maintain the molds and do those things?
So I think the answer is we'll see a mix. We're already seeing, 3D printing has already changed the miniatures industry. Stuff is now mocked up on 3D printers. And that's being done. Like I guarantee you, Forge World owns several very nice, very expensive 3D printers.
Yeah.
We are seeing some smaller companies move that way. So, like Raging Heroes, the people who made the Definitely Not Space Elves,
Right.
also somewhat NC-17, they've moved to, I believe, a Patreon or Kickstarter 3D printing model. Whoever makes the Fallout miniatures game, their terrain is all 3D printing files.
Okay.
Because they're never going to be able to print enough. They're never going to be able to manufacture enough crashed vertibots to make that worth it. So the answer is, look, if you want that, or a Red Rocket gas station or whatever, here's the file for it. So we are seeing that. I think for Games Workshop Prime, I can't imagine the several leaps in technology that would make that viable for, like, my 12-year-old nephew wants to get into Warhammer. Can you 3D print me stuff? Is like, no. I think for Forge World, hilariously, like the Mastodon is the worst sort of possible option for 3D printing because it's big and it's blocky.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, resin printers struggle with purely flat surfaces.
Yeah.
So like that, if you said, could you 3D print me a Mastodon? I think I would say no. Like, forgeworld.co.uk.
Right.
Just do it. I think what would be really interesting and maybe viable for them is thinking about the things that are like, essentially the things we talked about earlier as like, well, you don't sell these anymore, you don't make these. All of the fuss when they discontinued the various Horus Heresy upgrade kits.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no reason you can't 3D print Mark IV Space Marine shoulder pads.
Yeah.
Those are easy. So I could see them moving towards some of their stuff where it's like, look, we really don't want to take up the, resin casting time and the inventory space, etc., to maintain these.
Yeah.
Rats, here are Imperial Fist Mark III heads, the file.
Right.
I could see as sort of an end of life, almost legacy product.
Mm-hmm.
I would love that. Like if Forge World came out with Imperial Fist Mark III chest plates and stuff, I would buy those files in a second. And a lot of those files are already digital. And I think that's one of the keys is since everybody has moved to CAD, those CAD programs export to STL files. And there's some considerations for if you're 3D printing these, but for like helmets, it doesn't matter. I could see that, but I think I think for small niche companies, that's what's going to either eat those companies or have them switch to it. I know Victoria Miniatures has started sort of slowly starting to think about maybe I just sell 3D printed things, or at least I'm going to 3D print these instead of resin cast them. Mm-hmm. The one thing, and this is where I do get frustrated, is, and I mentioned this, is like those small creators, those files almost immediately end up being shared on the internet. So like, I think for Forge World, it might feel okay if it's like, look, we're not going to sell these again anyway. We're discontinuing this. Off into the wild you go. I think for those smaller creators, that's going to, like, you can actually tell them, like, you can see them be hurt on social media when people are sharing their files, because they're like, this is my business. Yeah. And this is like all I do. The one I go to a lot is Versatile Terrain, that makes the nameplates for Titans and stuff like that. There's now a Kickstarter for those nameplates, and there's some files on them online for those nameplates, and everyone's like, oh, it's really obvious and it's just not that hard to do. And I'm like, okay, but nobody did it before this guy did.
Right.
And you're all just essentially taking a small business and devouring it because you don't want to pay for things.
Right.
And that makes me obviously a little salty. I think that will be hard for those smaller creators, but I think that there's the bits companies that you see that sort of hang out at the periphery of the greater GW hobby space.
Right.
My guess is almost all of them are at least thinking about going to resin parts and 3D printable parts, and I know some of them have. So what is it? Anvil Industries also now has a monthly Patreon that they just give you files.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize at Versatile Terrain that they were one of the ones that people had done that. Because on the one hand, I see how somebody could say that. Like, oh, well, no, it's just, it's just a nameplate with a font. Like, of course. But, like you were saying.
And they are literally 3D printed. Like,
right.
I can tell you they're 3D printed, and he will tell you they're 3D printed.
Right. But it's funny because after you said that, I was like, I really should. Well, because also I got that battleship up here to paint right now on my hobby desk that I just got back after 6 weeks of repainting and moving my kids' room over the summer. It was a hell of a teacher summer, but yeah, no, I think I'm actually going to order them from them because I realize Colin orders a ton of stuff from them, and like I've heard nothing but good things about their customer service too. So I mean, them getting screwed a little bit actually is probably the last thing I needed to push and get those things ordered. So, well, man, I gotta say, I was tempted a couple of times looking at some of these printers throughout the thing. I think I'm still going to be the person who's barely. I think I'm going to be the person in that exercise video that had a heart attack just lifting their foot up a couple of times and not jump in at this point. But I hope this has been a useful guide, and the conversation has kind of helped people to sort of wrap their head around it, think about some things, and get some starting points to go to. So that's going to do it for us this month. Next month's topic came about from a text conversation between you, me, and Carl. So the name of the list was actually your reply to
Colin, not Carl.
Colin, I'm sorry. Wow, I had an 11 o'clock hockey game last night, and I am not doing well today in the brain department. Yeah, Colin, Jesus Christ, I almost gapped out there again. So the comment was, please give the name of the episode, because this was just a comment that you had responding to him cranking out an army really fast.
Meme list goes Bert.
So we're going to talk about themed lists, weird lists, how you make them work, and different approaches to doing it, and different ways to get those on the tabletop. So this is a topic that I always like, because for me, it's like making weird lists is just an excuse to paint a bunch of things that I like or whatever it is. And we were going to talk about like what those look like, how you go about using them, and how you make them work. So, well, I hope all this has been helpful. Thanks to Carl for coming on. Colin, if you're listening, sorry for butchering your name at the end there and conflating you and Carl at the same time. Eric, thanks for being here. We'll see you guys next time. You've been listening to the Lost to the Nails podcast. You can check out the latest from Eric at variancehammer.com. Brian's work can be checked out at Evil Space Elves Studio on Facebook and Evil Space Elves on Instagram. If you'd like to contact us, we can be reached at losttothenails@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next month.